Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenblatt, your policy recommendations in your testimony go under the rubric PROTECT, an acronym for a number of suggestions. And included among them is to oppose extremists in government service. And then there's detail on this point on page 14 that says the ban should be extended to individuals engaged in violent extremist activity. And I'd be surprised if anybody would disagree with that. Some might want to be careful to limit that, though, to those who've engaged in serious violence and not inadvertently extend it to, for example, Scott Smith, arrested at the Loudoun County School Board meeting after officials denied from the podium that his 9th grade daughter had been raped and sodomized in a bathroom at school. But first, do you say that someone like that example I just gave, should be barred from federal, state, or local public service?
Well, Mr. Congressman, thank you for the question. And I might just say, to start this off, how much I appreciate Dr. Miller Idris for her leadership and her research on all of these issues. So thank you, Dr. Miller Idris. So, Mr. Congressman, I don't know the specifics of this gentleman at the school board, but I absolutely think if you're involved in a white supremacist group, if you're involved in a group that threatens to overthrow the U.S. government, you should not
that one instance,
law enforcement.
Mr. Greenblatt, what about that? The one I just gave the example of, someone who was arrested for resisting because he had something like that happen from the dais at a public meeting.
I don't know anything about this person, Mr. Congressman, and his background.
So you're not prepared to say that person should not be barred from federal, state, or local service?
Yeah, I really don't know enough to say, but the situation with his daughter sounds horrible.
Beyond that, you recommend that those associated with violent extremist movements should be barred, and you applaud the DHS announcement that it will vet employees for, quote, extremist sympathies.
Yep.
So you recommend barring not only the violent, nor even those who sympathize with the violent, but those who sympathize with movements that are associated with violence. Is that right?
Sure. So if you have Nazi tattoos or if you have KKK tattoos, I think that should be a disqualifier. Yes, I do believe that.
Okay. How do you propose it be decided what it means for a movement to be associated with violence, or whether a person sympathizes with the violent acts of a movement as opposed to its nonviolent views? Well,
Mr. Congressman, I would ask you, if you had an intern who showed up with Nazi tattoos on his neck, would you think that person was qualified to represent you in your office in the United States Congress?
Okay, let me ask you something. Maybe we can make it a little bit tougher than that obvious example.
Okay.
You take extremism. On your website, it says it's a concept used to describe religious, social, or political belief systems that exist substantially outside of belief systems more broadly accepted in society, i.e. mainstream beliefs. So it's something out of the mainstream. It goes on beyond that, but it comes to this sentence, which is interesting. Not every extremist movement is bad. The abolitionist movement is one example of an extreme movement that had admirable goals. But most extremist movements exist outside of the mainstream because many of their views or tactics are objectionable. All right, here's another example, Mr. Greenblatt. Women's suffrage, too, was an extremist movement at one time, correct?
I don't know if I would characterize it that way, but it's certainly out of the mainstream in its early days, yes.
Out of the mainstream, and there were proponents of it who used violence. Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so I was reading a book on Winston Churchill. They threw bricks at him. There was a bombing or two. This is in Europe, and I don't know all the details of it here. So how would you then say that anybody who was associated with women's suffrage would be then barred from, or sympathized with it, would be barred from government service?
Well, I certainly think if you believe it's appropriate to bomb government buildings or to assault prime ministers, you shouldn't be in government service, yes.
So, but I'm asking for something a little more refined than that. Okay. Someone who sympathizes with the women's suffrage movement, and then some people who are advocates of women's suffrage or activists for it, engaged in some violence. Does that mean the person who sympathizes with the movement should be barred from government service?
Well, I most definitely think if you're unable to disassociate yourself with movements that espouse violence or supremacy of any group, yes, you should be barred from government service. You can support women's suffrage and not support harming government officials.
Sure. I think what you're posing is easy. What's hard is, how do you say that, or who judges and by what standard whether they have adequately disassociated themselves with the violent acts of some extremists associated with the movement, but not the broader goals of a movement?
It's a fair question. So again, if we talk about Al-Qaeda, we talk about ISIS, we talk about some of the horrific anti-Israel people out there who say the Jewish state is committing genocide. You know, Mr. Congressman, I don't think they belong as interns in your office or any public office for that matter. I feel very strongly about that. That kind of extremism should have no place.
I join you, sir. I think the problem is at the margins, you raise a lot of very difficult questions, and you pose the possibility of imposing very significantly on fundamental constitutional freedoms. And your recommendation does not include much of a roadmap in terms of how to separate that out. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.